Be here this morning. We appreciate your presence with us. Especially if you are visiting, we want you to know that you are our honored guest and hope that you will stick around for just a couple of minutes after services so we can introduce ourselves and get to know you just a little bit better. Today is the last sermon that we'll be spending on spiritual renewal. We have spent the last quarter, basically, 13 weeks, looking at the book of Deuteronomy and how we can renew our spiritual selves. And so we will finish that lesson up today on how to renew our peace. It's the closing part of the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses is not going into the promised land. You may remember the story that during the wilderness wanderings, after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, at one point they were complaining that they had no water. And so God told Moses and Aaron to speak to a rock in order for water to come out of that rock. God was going to work a miracle to show how he was still taking care of them. But Moses, in his anger, not against God, but against the children of Israel for their rebelliousness, for their complaining, for their grumbling, in his anger, he struck the rock. And God still allowed the water to come out, but because of Moses' disobedience, God will not allow him to enter the promised land with the rest of the children of Israel. And Moses begged God to reconsider, and God told him no, and that was his final decision. And so Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land. And so the entire book of Deuteronomy, as we have pointed out before, is basically Moses renewing the spiritual covenant between God and the children of Israel. And he has spent the entire book basically reminding them of what all God has done for them. He has told them about if they will follow God, that they will be blessed. If they choose to disobey God, that there will be curses. And so he wants them to renew their commitment to following God. And that is what we have been doing, is looking at the book of Deuteronomy as a springboard to renewing our spiritual commitment. Now you might imagine the children of Israel are anxious about their future. They know that Moses has been their leader for 40 years. He's the one that brought them with the power of God out of the land of Egypt. He has been with them the entire 40 years, and now he's about to not be with them anymore. And so you might imagine they're anxious, they're nervous, they're maybe even afraid. How are they going to survive without Moses' leadership? And so here at the close of the book of Deuteronomy, in fact, if you want to turn to chapter 33, that's where we'll be looking this morning, Deuteronomy 33. Moses is seeking to give them some final words of comfort. Some final things to say to them to help calm their anxiety and to reassure them that everything is going to be okay, because God has always been the one that has been taking care of them. But in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 27, as he is finishing up his oratory, his speech, his talk to the children of Israel, he says the following. He says, "The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms." I want us to take this verse, and we're going to look at basically three words out of this verse this morning that gave the children of Israel comfort. They can also give us comfort as well. Notice, the eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. That last phrase there, underneath are the everlasting arms, are what I want us to look at this morning. Now, when Rylan was a baby, or a toddler, if you will, I used to do this to him. It would freak Kathy out, because she was always scared I was going to drop him, okay? But you'll notice I've got his ankles, and he's holding onto my arm. That is not the picture that we get in Deuteronomy here, is it? God is not dangling us and we're holding on for dear life, but rather Moses says God's everlasting arms are underneath us. He is supporting us. He is taking care of us. This is the picture that we get there from Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 27, that God is holding on to us and that he's not going to let us go, that we have a solid foundation with him. And so I want to look at those three words in that phrase there. The first one is the word, if I can get the slide to change there, underneath. Underneath. You know, most people want to know at some point in their lives, what is the meaning of life? And wouldn't it be great if we could take this blank right here and say, the meaning of life is blank. And for those of you who are science fiction fans, you know that the answer to this is 42. Okay? If you don't get that, don't worry about it. I'll explain it later, all right? But the meaning of life is blank. We want to understand that. We want to comprehend it. What is the meaning of life? Well, you know what? In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses has answered that question for the children of Israel, and he's answered it for us as well. According to Moses, if we go back and look throughout the entire book of Deuteronomy, which is what we've been doing in this study, Moses basically says that life, or the meaning of life, is that God has promised to take care of us if we will put him first. That's basically the meaning of life. When people question, why am I here? What's my purpose? Why am I on this earth? We are here to serve God, to love him, to obey him, to follow his will. And in doing so, we are helping others out. We are striving to reach the promised land of heaven. And if we do that, then he has promised to be with us and to take care of us. That's it. It's that simple. There's nothing that's mysterious about it. There's nothing that's really deeper if you want to think about it. Now, how we serve God, how we please him, how we minister to others, that's kind of what we do in living our life here. And we find the answers to that right here. But this is the meaning of life, to love God, to serve him. Jesus basically said that when he was asked what were the greatest commandments, or what was the greatest commandment. That's what the person was asking. What am I supposed to do? What am I doing here in life? What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus' answer was, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like to it, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the meaning of life. Now, the Israelites, in their own minds, appeared hopeless without Moses. They didn't know if they could get through life without him, because he had been their leader for so long. And so Moses, again, takes time in the book of Deuteronomy to assure them that God had been with them, and he takes time to explain and to remind them of how God had been with them, how he had taken care of them, and that he would continue to be with them. You know, at times, life may seem impossible for us. I don't know if you can read all the words right there on that, but, you know, problems, stress, work, family, debts, worry, no time, all these different things that weigh on us, that we think are, you know, important, and they are important in a certain way. But sometimes we get like the children of Israel, and we think that life is impossible. How are we going to get through this? How are we ever going to get to the end? We're frightened of the future, and we're terrified of our own weaknesses. And at times, life may seem impossible. We may feel like we're walking a tightrope between heaven and earth. But you know what? Like that tightrope walker wants that safety net under him, and especially when they're practicing. If you've ever been to the circus or seen the circus practicing, you know, they've got that safety net under them. And many tightrope walkers or acrobats, they'll have that net even when they're performing. Now, some like to be real daredevils, and they take that safety net away. But I guarantee you, they want it there. They're just trying to show how brave they are and give you a good show. Well, as Christians, guess what? We have that safety net. We have the arms of God underneath us. We have a foundation that is built on him. And so Moses tells the children of Israel, underneath you are the everlasting arms. They didn't have to worry about going it alone. They didn't have to worry about what would happen when Moses was gone, because again, God had always been with them, and he was going to continue to be with them and to support them and be that foundation underneath them. That brings me to the second word that I want to look at there, and that is arms. Arms. Underneath us are the arms of God. You know, we used to sing the song. You probably heard it. He's got the whole world in his hands. And this is what we picture, that God is holding the planet Earth there in his hands. I don't know if that's exactly how the earth is supported, but it's a good mental image, isn't it? That God is there, and we are in his hands and his arms, those strong arms. Underneath us are the arms of God. Now, arms implies not just something like that net that was in that previous picture. It's not just something that's there, but it's someone. It is someone who is living, conscious, powerful, who cares personally for those that he loves. In the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, Peter writes, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. God cares for us. And the idea, that picture there that Moses gives, is that God's arms are there underneath them. That there's a personality there, someone who cares deeply for them. Look at what all he had done for them in the past. He brought them out of slavery in Egypt when he heard their cry. The time was right, and he sent those plagues to convince Pharaoh and the Egyptians to let them go. When they were released, he guided them with a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. When they got to the Red Sea and they felt trapped with Pharaoh's army behind them, God parted the waters and they went through on dry land. Then he closed up the waters on Pharaoh's army and destroyed them so that the children of Israel had nothing to worry about anymore. As they're in the wilderness on their way to the promised land, God is feeding them. He sends manna, and then later on he sends meat in the form of birds. He gives them water from the rock. He was taking care of them the entire time. He was always there with them. Those of you may remember, maybe you did this with your kids. We were swimming in the pool the other day, and Sheridan likes to get up on the ladder, and she'll say, "I'm going to jump, Daddy," but she won't jump unless I'm right there to catch her, even though she's got her floaties on and everything. I have to hold my arms out because she wants to know that someone's going to be there to catch her when she jumps. We're the same way spiritually. God's arms, though, are so much more powerful and secure than our arms, or than anything that we might try to put our trust in. Because, a lot of times we do that as human beings. We try to put our trust and our faith in things, whether it be the money we've got in our bank account, whether it be the job that we've had for years, whether it be all of the material possessions that we have, it might even be our families. We try to put our faith and our trust in those things. Guess what? Those things are going to fail eventually. That money's going to get spent. That car is going to wear out. That house is going to fall down one day if it's not maintained. That family is going to go away eventually. But God will never leave us or forsake us. And you know what? He knows when we're afraid. He knows when we're heartbroken. He knows when we are in danger. He knows what our needs are. And so he's always there with his arms, not ready to catch us when we fall, but holding on to us. Now, because God is spirit, those arms can only be seen by faith. But you know what? It's not a blind faith. So you may hear sometimes people talk about taking that blind leap of faith. As Christians, it's not blind. We're not just stepping out on faith without any evidence of all of God being there. In fact, the evidence of God being there is overwhelming to tell us that he is there. In fact, again, Moses spends much of his time in Deuteronomy reminding the children of Israel how God had taken care of them and how he would continue to take care of them. The evidence was there. All they had to do was look back. The things that I just mentioned a few moments ago, in addition to all the other things God had done for them. Moses reminds them of this. And he says, God's been there for you. We need to do the same thing. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, Paul writes there, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, note, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." Paul here is basically saying all we got to do is open our eyes, look at the world that is around us, and we can know without a shadow of a doubt that there is a God who created it and who sustains it and who cares about us and loves us. All we have to do is look. The psalmist writes in Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." I know I've said this before. If you've never been out to the beach, especially like today when a storm's coming, and seen the power of those waves, or been out in the country on a very dark night and looked up at the sky and been able to see the Milky Way, or pick whatever you want to in nature, the mountains, the valleys, the Grand Canyon, whatever it is, all you got to do is look around and know that there is a God who created it all. That's what these two verses tell us. But even more than that, you can, like the children of Israel, look in your own life and see what he has done for you, how he has taken care of you, how you've gotten to this point right here today where you are sitting in this building worshiping him because of what he has done for you. And that's not to say that everyone's life has been perfect. In fact, I would say that nobody's life in here has been perfect. We've had our struggles. We've had bad things that have happened to us. But we're here because God has sustained us and He has taken care of us. And that's what we need to look back on and know that He will continue to be there. The third and final word that I want to look at in that verse is the word everlasting. Not only is God underneath us, not only are His arms there underneath us supporting us and taking care of us, but Moses describes them as everlasting arms. And there are three ways that God's arms are everlasting. First, note Job chapter 40 and verse 9. When Job was asking God why all these things have been happening to him, and God responds with questions, one of the questions that he says to Job is, have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like His? I like that question though. Have you an arm like God? The answer to that is no, we don't. We don't have arms like God. But how are God's arms everlasting? Three ways. Number one, God's arms are everlasting in that they will never tire. They will never get tired. In Psalm chapter 90 and verse 2, we read, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around, but God is eternal. He had no beginning, and He will have no end. And we as human beings, finite human beings, who to everything has a beginning and an end, we can't comprehend that. But God is everlasting, and His arms will never tire. Going back to Moses here for a moment, many of you may remember the story that's recounted in Exodus chapter 17. As the Israelites are going through the wilderness, they had to fight some battles against the peoples that they encountered. One of the peoples they had to fight were the Amalekites. And for whatever reason, God said that whenever the children of Israel, and at this point Joshua was leading the army in battle, and Moses is up on the mountain, and God had said as long as Moses' arms were raised in the air, Israel would prevail. The army would be successful. But as soon as he let his arms down, the Amalekites would start to win the battle. And so Moses had to keep his arms up, and as is depicted in this painting here, his brother Aaron and Hur had to literally hold his arms up for him because he was getting so tired to ensure Israel's victory. You see, God's arms, however, never get like that. God's arms never tire because they are everlasting. A second way they are everlasting is that for God's arms, no load is too great. We mentioned 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. He says, casting all your cares or your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. It doesn't matter how many cares you have. It doesn't matter how much you need to put on God. He can handle it. And He wants you to give it to Him. You may have seen in the Olympics or in other competitions when people try to lift weights, sometimes they fail because the load is too great, it's too much. They can't lift it, they're not strong enough. And a lot of times in our lives we feel that way. We feel that we are just so loaded down with burdens and so loaded down with care and so loaded down with disappointment and with anxiety and with all these things that we feel like we just can't handle it. Well, guess what? We can't, but God can. And He tells us to give Him our burdens, and He will bear them for us. We may feel that our burdens are too great to bear, our problems are too big to overcome, our emotions are too complicated to deal with, but nothing is too great for God. Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 27 and verse 17. And I put those out of order on purpose. God says, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me? And previously, 10 verses before, Jeremiah says, nothing is too hard for you. God asks a rhetorical question that Jeremiah had already answered. Nothing is too hard for God. And so we need to remember that. We need to give Him all of our burdens, all of our cares, all of our anxieties, because we can't deal with them on our own. And yet we try because we think, we're human and I don't want to bother God, or I don't want to burden Him, or I'm not important enough, or He doesn't care about me. Don't convince yourself of that. He wants you to give them to Him because He will bear those burdens for us. Thirdly, His arms are everlasting because we can never outgrow them. We can never outgrow them. I can't do that to Rylan anymore. He's too big. and I'm too weak. When we get in the pool now to swim, he tries to get on my back, or, for some reason, and y'all tell me, especially you dads, if this happened with you growing up, if I happen to get down on all fours on the floor to look for something or to they think that's an invitation to pile on my back. Anybody? Okay, I see some heads nodding. All right, good. I'm glad I'm not alone, right? I can't do that anymore. Maybe we're sharing it and bring something I can ride them around, like a horse or a pony. But Rylan and Laura, they're too big. I can't do it anymore. I'm getting too old and too weak. Eventually, kids outgrow their parents. Literally and figuratively. They get too big to play with. They get too big to carry around. Then they get too big to want to follow your rules. They get too big for their britches. They get too big, and eventually they move out on their own. And that's life. That's what happens. That's the way God has designed it. But you know what? We can never outgrow God because he's got the whole world in his hands. We are in his arms, and he will never leave us. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5 says, "For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." God's not going anywhere. Now, we may choose to. Like the prodigal son, we may choose to turn our backs on God and go out and sow our wild oats or go off and do what we want to do because we don't want to obey him. But God remains where he is, waiting for us to return home. And you know what? Even in our twilight years on this earth, God will still be there. Those three words in that passage there, underneath, arms, and everlasting, are so important. But there's one more word that's not there, but I want us to look at it as we close out this study and as we close out the book of Deuteronomy here, because I think it's something that's implied in this passage there. And that is that God's arms are everlasting, they are underneath us, but they are also consoling. You see, Moses, as he's saying this right there in that passage, he's getting ready to die. He knows that he's not going to be allowed into the promised land, and he knows his time has come. And so he is giving the children of Israel these final words, and he closes his speech to them in the very next verses. And then the Bible tells us that he goes up on Mount Pisgah, and God did allow him to look into the promised land, as is depicted right here, but not to enter it. He allowed him to look, and that book tells us that Moses died there on Mount Pisgah, never being able to enter the promised land. But you know what? I think that even as he's there getting ready to move on, God was comforting not just Moses, but the children of Israel as well. They were comforted by his providence. They found the strength to carry on without Moses. God comforts us in the midst of our sorrow, even when we may be facing our own death. And I'm sure Moses must have been comforted as he climbed Mount Pisgah to face his own death, and he trusted God's everlasting arms to carry him to a far better land than that promised land could even be. I think that's why David writes in Psalm 23 and verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Even when we are facing our own demise, even when we are getting ready to leave this world, as Christians, we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to dread that because we look forward to a better place. And we see, as David says here, that God is with us, and he will carry us to that better place. The everlasting arms of God will always be there for us, underneath us, supporting us, carrying us, always sustaining us. And this morning, God's arms are reaching out to you. I mentioned the story of the prodigal son and how that father never moved, but rather he stood there, the Bible tells us, daily, looking down the road, waiting for his son to come back home to him. And eventually one day, the Bible tells us that he saw that son afar off, and it says he ran to meet him. God is waiting for us if we are not with him right now. If we are not Christians, or if we have wandered away and have left him, he's waiting for us to come back. He wants to support us. He wants to hold on to us. He wants to take care of us. He loves us. But the choice is up to us. Will we come back to him? Will we give our lives to him? And so this morning, the invitation is open. If you need to come back to God, if you need to repent of your sins, if you need to confess the name of his Son before men and be buried with him in the act of baptism, having your sins washed away, becoming a Christian, becoming a child of God, you can make that right this morning. If you've done that in the past and you've wandered away, you've left God, you've gone out of his arms, he's waiting for you to come back, and you can make that right this morning. Maybe you're here, you just need prayers for strength or for encouragement. Whatever your need might be, we invite you to come and respond as together we stand.